All right, here we go. So we've got some questions to answer. All right, so here we go, Lieutenant. I'm gonna try to do maybe 3 questions in one and then 3 in the other. So first question is, could you describe the typical African American's experience living in the U.S. prior and just entering World War II? Well, 1619 is really when is the date when blacks were first forcibly brought here, and so from that point on up until the end of the Civil War, they're pretty much, if you're in the South or in enslaved states, you know, you were enslaved. If you were in the North, you may not have been enslaved, but you still had to deal with certain types of discrimination. And so after the Civil War, when slavery at least is abolished to some degree by the 13th Amendment, blacks are still having to deal with the same types of things that they dealt with prior to. In the North, you still have racism, you still have different various types of discrimination. In the South was, you had a lot of other stuff going on down there in addition to. And for instance, states pretty much determined how they were going to fulfill the Constitution. And so the first year after Civil War, you had about 1,000 lynchings. And then between 1882 and 1969, I believe, you had just under 5,000. And we don't know how many were lynched between 1866 and 1882. So you've got that going on for blacks. What's happening with blacks going into World War I? Well, certainly, you've got people protesting to be a part of the war effort. One thing is for certain, that defending the country and full citizenship go hand in hand. And so blacks have always essentially tried to be a part of that, which leads us into question number 2. Since the Revolutionary War, blacks have been defending this country. Normally, they would not be allowed to fight until the country's back was against the wall. It happened in the Revolutionary War. It happened in the War of 1812. And blacks, actually, lawfully, it was illegal for blacks to defend the country. It's not until Mr. Lincoln's January 1st Emancipation Proclamation that is actually unenforceable, except the clause where he says, any man of African descent who wants to fight for the Union Army or the Union Navy will be allowed to do so. And so over 209,000 blacks end up fighting during the war. As a result of that, afterwards, they're able to fight legally. They fought in World War I. In 1925, there was a report, it was called The Use of Negro Manpower in Wartime. It was an Army report in 1925, essentially said that you could not trust blacks for anything other than menial jobs. They were leaderless, they were not patriotic, they had smaller brains, afraid of the dark, superstitious, all sorts of stuff. And if they were in combat, they turned tail and run, even though there was, at that point, empirical evidence that attested to the opposite. And so that's the lens through which the military is looking through prior to the beginning of World War II. Of course, blacks fight, they distinguish themselves. And at that point, it's never a question as to whether or not blacks would fight. That question was answered. After World War II, blacks start to fight and die in disproportionate numbers, but that's a whole different topic. So yeah, blacks pretty much wanted to fight. They saw this, the words that Jefferson had written, that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They held that for themselves. And so for many of them, they did want to fight for their posterity, or those who were coming after them. I must also say that I have talked to some World War II veterans, particularly those who were Tuskegee Airmen, African-American aviators, and they said, hey, look, the reason why I wanted to fly was because I liked airplanes, or I didn't want to end up in the Army digging ditches, or in the Navy washing dishes on somebody's ship. So, all right, number 3, how many states at that point of the war and prior to had no legal barriers to African American voting? Well, it's interesting because it's not really a function of the war per se. That was a fight that was fought from the very beginning, the right to vote. and you had northern states that, for the most part, had more access for blacks to vote. But remember, in the South, that thing was not happening. And the Constitution, actually, when it talks about for individuals who were not considered free, they would be counted as 3/5 towards representation. So for every 100 individuals who were not free, you would count them towards 60, or they would be counted as 60 towards that magic count. I think it was 30,000 to get another representative. And even though they were counted, they were not allowed to vote. So, and there's an argument today that, voter suppression is still going on. So it's not necessarily a function of the war per se, not directly, but yeah. So people were trying to, they will be fighting for their right to vote long into the civil rights movement. How many states changed their laws after the war ended? I don't know what that number is. I mean, I'm sure it's easy to figure out. You probably have to go state by state to see when their laws changed. But remember, 14th Amendment and 14th and 15th Amendments were supposed to guarantee that, but it was left up to the states how they wanted to implement it. And so some of them would have poll taxes. They would have grandfather clauses. If your grandfather wasn't registered to vote, then you can't register. And of course, they had literacy tests, which you had to pass to the registrar's satisfaction. The registrar may not be able to read it all. So there were still ways of blocking people from voting. As a matter of fact, it's not until 1965 the Voters' Rights Amendment was signed by President Johnson. So you can see even long after the war, that issue of voting was still a problem. Oh, very good question. Were African Americans serving in the armed forces barred from voting, sending in absentee ballots? What is interesting is this. Now, we've already talked about the difficulties there were in voting. But I talked to some Tuskegee Airmen today, actually, and Colonel Stewart told me, Harry Stewart from Dearborn, Michigan, he said he was too young to vote. And I'm thinking, man, was he 17 when he went into the military? But remember, the age to vote was 21. So you got a lot of young men who were drafted and going overseas who weren't even at their age of voting. That did not change until July 1st, 1971. And it was during the Vietnam War. And part of the argument was this. You were sending these 18-year-olds over to be killed. They were old enough to die, but they were not old enough to vote. So that's when that amendment changed. But for the most part, all of the veterans I talked to, they don't remember voting. So to be honest, I don't know how they pulled that off. That's an interesting question. It would certainly, I'm sure we could figure it out, but yeah, I don't know how many of those guys actually had a chance to vote. Remember, their hands are full. They've got a whole lot of other stuff going on other than just simply thinking about it. And particularly in World War II, you're talking the election of 1944. And a lot of those guys are already overseas and they're already fighting. So, and then let's see, question number 6. How are the servicemen and women treated coming home? Oh my goodness. So what I'm about to say is, most of them were treated how I'm going to describe it. Colonel Jefferson told me, he says that when he came home, he came down the gangplank, and at the bottom there was a corporal standing there with 2 signs, white to one side, color to the other. And Colonel Jefferson was like, well, look at this. Well, you'd have to know Colonel Jefferson. He has some pretty colorful language. At the same time, Colonel Stewart said that when he came home, he didn't see that. So it was different. And that's just coming down off the gangplank. Of course, these guys, men and women, are overseas fighting for democracy and liberty, and come home and have to fight for the same thing. And there were instances where people were lynched in uniform. So, that happened as well. They still, segregation was still going on. You couldn't go into restaurants even in uniform. And so that would happen. And I heard a friend of mine used to work with him. He was in Korea. He says he went over, got 2 Purple Hearts. And when he came home, went to a restaurant in San Francisco and they would not serve him. And he said it hurt him to his heart. And so, yeah, I think we would probably rather say that, you know, when folk got over there, they fought together and it was one team, but it just was not the case. White POW, German POWs would be allowed to eat in restaurants through the front door, and black servicemen had to go through the back. So, yeah, so that's it's an interesting time, and I think we can learn from our past, and if we don't, we will definitely repeat it. And that's why I'm so adamant about saying that this next generation of scholars have to be the ones that take that. When you get the keys to the car, you'll probably have to deal with that type of situation, and you guys have to know certainly how you're going to deal with it. All right, well, that's it, I think. It has been nice, and I hope I've answered your questions. Hope I've